Yeah. Hello. Hello, everybody. Good evening. In a few minutes, we're going to start the seminar. So I hope everyone is safe. Everybody's safe at home. And so welcome to the second international seminar on ecology of the graduate program in Ecology of URGS, Universidade Federal do Rio Grande do Sul, Brazil. So my name is Luciana Podgajski. I am a postdoctoral researcher, and I'm very happy to be here and to introduce you our guest speaker, Dr. Alan Andersen. So Dr. Alan is from Charles Darwin University in Australia, and he's one of the most important ant community ecologists. So he's a pioneer in the use of ant functional groups to understand the response of ant communities to environmental stress and disturbances. So Dr. Alan Andersen has been working with biogeography and global ecology of ants, using ants as bioindicators in land management. He has also made internationally important contributions to fire ecology, underpinning the importance of fire management for biodiversity conservation. So we are very pleased to have Dr. Alan Andersen here tonight to bring us the fascinating world of ants and their relationship with disturbances.
Thank you, Luciana. Thank you very much. And hello, everyone. It really is a great pleasure to be with you. It's first thing in the morning, my time. So a great way for me to start my day. So I'll just share my screen now. And I wanted to start off by just emphasizing how important disturbance is. And it's not just in terms of importance for understanding how ecosystems work, understanding the dynamics of ecosystems, but it's really crucial for managing ecosystems, because if you look at the drivers of ecosystems, here, climate, soil, hydrology, it's really only disturbance that's amenable to management at the landscape scale. And so ecosystem management is really all about the management of disturbance. And so to be managing ecosystems effectively, we really need to understand how those ecosystems respond to disturbance. And we have a pretty good understanding of the disturbance ecology of vegetation. And to a large degree, that's because vegetation and disturbance, or the effects of disturbance on vegetation, are just highly visible. We can see it. I think it also reflects, though, that disturbance ecology has a longer history in plant ecology than it does in zoology. And so on the one hand, we understand how vegetation is affected by disturbance pretty well, but we just don't have that same understanding of how fauna respond to disturbance. And so that's what I want to talk about today, using ants as a focal group. And there's some good reasons for using ants as a focal group for understanding the responses of fauna to disturbance more generally. And I've put a few of these up here. One of them is that ants are the dominant faunal group globally in terms of biomass. And a number of figures have been bandied around. It's obviously a very difficult figure to get a hold of with any degree of precision. But figures range from 10 to about 30% of global terrestrial faunal biomass represented by ants, which is, pretty phenomenal, really. So there's a huge number of them. They perform many key ecological functions throughout ecosystems, ranging from soils through to vegetation and interactions with other animals. And I don't have time to go through them, but one of the most important faunal groups functionally, if not the most important functionally globally. And as Luciana mentioned, they're often used as ecological indicators. And so if one wants to use a group as an indicator of ecological health or ecological change, then it really is important to have a very sound understanding of their disturbance dynamics. And the relatively small amount of research that has been done on this last topic indicates that ants reflect the disturbance responses of many other taxa. Now, obviously not all other taxa, but they do reflect the disturbance responses of many other taxa, and I'll be talking more about that later on. And so in this talk, I'm going to base it around 5 principles. And these 5 principles can be used to, first of all, just explain how disturbance affects ants. But also, more important than just explaining it, is a strong predictive capacity. So it enables the prediction of variation in responses among species, among communities, and in different habitats. And I've got here wide applicability to plants and other faunal groups. And so I won't have time to go into this, but that is what I feel, is that these 5 principles do have very, very wide applicability to plants and animals more generally. One of the problems when trying to synthesize disturbance dynamics is disturbance is so variable. There's so many different agents of disturbance that it's often a case of comparing apples with oranges. And so what I'll be doing throughout this presentation is, as much as possible, using responses of to fire to illustrate the principles. And this means that we've got a common currency of disturbance, which makes it much more feasible to be comparing responses to, essentially the same disturbance. I also need to define what I'm talking about in terms of disturbance, because disturbance can mean many things to many people, and I'm taking the Phil Grime strict definition of disturbance that he uses for understanding vegetation ecology, and that is defining disturbance as any factor that removes biomass. And that is very distinct from environmental stress, which refers to factors that limit the production of biomass. In other words, limit productivity. And I think this is a very important distinction, because the removal of biomass, disturbance, is actually a very, very different process ecologically than those factors that limit the production of biomass, limit productivity. And so if we start with that, disturbance. So strictly speaking, disturbance for an ant community means the removal of ant biomass. But when we talk about effects of disturbance on ants, we're really talking about the effects of disturbance of the habitat on ants, because that sort of disturbance in most cases results in very limited loss of ant biomass, because most ants are nesting in the soil. And so from an ant perspective, the direct effects of disturbance, that is removing ant biomass, is really only significant when there's either very major soil disturbance, or when ants are nesting above ground and therefore susceptible to significant biomass loss. And that does happen for arboreal species, as you'll be well aware that many ant species live exclusively in plants. And here's some data from Kenya, on the effects of savanna fires on the mortality of ant species living in these swollen thorns of an acacia species there. And you can see this is the relationship between the survivorship of ant colonies and the height of the trees. And you can see at very low heights, there's only 20% survivorship, in other words, 80% mortality of colonies, but the survivorship increases with height. And once the height's above about 5 meters, then most colonies survive. And in that sense, the effects of fire in terms of removing biomass are not direct like that. And it's interesting in that there's evidence of the effects of fire having or eliciting an evolutionary response among the ant species there. There are several ant species that nest in these swollen thorns, and one of them, a species of Tetraponera, just stays in its nest when a fire comes, and it suffers particularly high mortality because of that. Whereas another species here, Chromatogaster, a species of Chromatogaster, when it perceives smoke, it evacuates its nest in those thorns and relocates the nest to cracks within the soil, and therefore survives. And so this species has very little mortality due to fires. So this is the first principle, I think, and again that I think applies to most plant and animal species, is that the most important effects of habitat disturbance are typically indirect, not the direct effects in terms of removal of biomass, but these indirect effects through effects on habitat structure and resource availability. And then related to that, it's abiotic interactions such as predation and competition. These are the most important effects of disturbance. They're indirect effects. The next principle, I think, is the key to it all, to understanding ant responses to disturbance, and that is the primacy or the fundamental importance of habitat openness. And the effects of disturbance is to increase habitat openness, either generally or to create small open micro-habitats. And I think it's really important to appreciate that habitat openness is a fundamental determinant of ecosystem dynamics, and many plant or animal species can be classified according to their response to openness. Shade tolerant versus light demanding. Now these are terms used primarily for plants, but I think they have equal currency for animals as well. And that there is this fundamental dichotomy between, or within taxa of both plants and animals, of species that are tolerant to shade and species that are intolerant of shade and need open habitats. And I'll give an illustration. I mean, the best known and most dramatic illustration is the contrast between forests and savannas. And as you will well know, that in higher rainfall areas that experience a seasonality of rainfall, and there's lots of that in Brazil, you can have both savanna and forest, rainforest, coexisting, and they have fundamentally different biotas. In the rainforest, shade tolerant biota that cannot exist in open habitats, and in savanna, light demanding biota that in many cases cannot exist in forest. And there are many, many other important functional differences between plants in forests compared with savannas, and that's also the case for animals. And I'll give you an example with ants. So here's some data from forest, rainforest and savanna in northern Australia, where these pie charts illustrate the relative abundances of different ant functional groups. And don't worry about what all these functional groups mean. You can just see, looking at the two charts, how fundamentally different they are. And in particular, there's a major difference in the black shading functional group in the savannas down the bottom. DD stands for dominant Dolichodorini. These are behaviourally dominant ants in the subfamily Dolichodorini, behaviourally dominant Dolichodorines, that are the most abundant and behaviourally dominant ants in most habitats globally that are most highly productive. And then the red are the specialist thermophilic ants, hot climate specialists that only occur in hot open habitats. And you can see that they dominate numerically the savannas in terms of functional composition, but are totally absent from the forests here in these data I'm showing. So that's that second principle, is appreciating the fundamental importance of habitat openness to biota, and appreciating that a major mechanism of impact of disturbance is through its effect on habitat openness. And so the third principle follows on from that, and that is that the responses of species to disturbance are therefore determined to a large degree by their responses to habitat openness. And I've contrasted these open adapted, often highly thermophilic, that is that they favour very hot conditions, species that are often increases in relation to disturbance, because disturbance, by increasing habitat openness, increases the amount of sun that gets directly to the soil surface. And so therefore increases the thermal environment of ants, and therefore favouring these open adapted thermophilic species that often belong to these two functional groups that I mentioned, the dominant Dolichodorini and the hot climate specialists. Contrasting with these shade adapted species, these forest specialists, and I've listed some of these functional groups there, that are often decreases in relation to disturbance. And I'll illustrate this by showing some data from a tropical savanna in northern Australia that I worked extensively with, contrasting a typical thermophilic open habitat adapted ant, Iridomyrmex sanguineus at the top, with a typical forest associated ant, Ecological smaragdina. So Ecophylla is the weaver ant that many of you might be familiar with, and contrasting their responses to fire. And you can see that the highly thermophilic Iridomyrmex increases its abundance dramatically in burn. So these are experimental fires, and you can see the red line going up after a longer period of experimental burning, favoured by the burning. And in contrast, the forest-associated Ecophylla, its abundance declines dramatically with experimental burning. And again, this just reflects their preference for shady versus open habitats. And it's interesting, and I'll come back to the importance of biogeography in a little while, it also reflects their evolutionary origins. That Iridomyrmex originated from Australia. It's an Australian autochthonous genus, and most abundant in arid areas, and so that's where it's come from. It's come from arid Australia, whereas Ecophylla is an old world tropical forest genus that's found in Africa and in forests of Africa and Asia, and it's relatively recently come into Australia naturally over the last few million years, as Australia has drifted north and has bumped up against the Southeast Asian continental plate and has received a lot of the Southeast Asian fauna, and Ecophylla is part of that. The fourth principle is, again, following the theme of the primary importance of habitat openness, is that a species' response to disturbance will inevitably vary among habitats because disturbance will have a different effect on the relative openness of different habitats. And so if you look at the left-hand side of this figure of different vegetation types varying in openness, a forest, a closed forest. So any substantial disturbance will have a major impact on forest structure because it will open up that forest. It will create openings that don't occur there in the absence of disturbance. And so disturbance will have a relatively strong effect on the structure of forest habitat. Whereas that same disturbance in a habitat that is already open will be relatively weak because that habitat already has lots of openness because of the effects of environmental stress. And so if you contrast forest on the left with savanna on the far right, savanna vegetation is driven by the seasonal availability of water, or at least the seasonal lack of water, which creates an open habitat. And so it's already open, and a disturbance by creating openness will not necessarily have a major impact on the structure of that habitat. So just illustrating that the same disturbance can have markedly different effects on habitat structure depending on the openness of that habitat. And so that means that the same ant species, if it occurs widely across habitats, can have very different responses to the same disturbance. And so if you take the example of a widespread species, but it prefers open habitats, if it occurs in forest, disturbance in that forest will increase habitat favourability for it, and therefore it will be an increaser in relation to habitat disturbance. Whereas that same species in a habitat that's already open may have no response to disturbance because the habitat is already open. Or if the disturbance is such that it makes the already open habitat even more open beyond its open habitat preference, that species then may become a decreaser if its habitat favourability is reduced. So just an illustration of how it can be explained why one species can respond very differently to the same disturbance, but in different habitats. And I'll give an illustration of some of the work my Brazilian PhD student, Gabriela, did here in Central Australia, looking at the effects of grazing on ants. And she looked at two different land systems, Chandler land system with very different habitat, and Mulga land system with very different habitat. And you can see the same species, an undescribed species of Mellophorus in Chandler. It increased its abundance with increasing grazing intensity. That is, it was an increaser. But in the Mulga land system, it was a reverse. It was a decreaser in relation to increasing grazing intensity. The fifth point is that ant community responses will vary according to their functional composition in relation to openness. So it's not just vary because different habitats are differentially affected by disturbance due to their differences in pre-existing habitat openness, but they also can have functionally different ant faunas, and those functionally different ant faunas will respond differently to disturbance. So some ant faunas are much more tolerant to disturbance, and others are less tolerant to disturbance. And so you have variation among habitats, but well, here's an example of this. This is a slide I showed you before about the functional differences between ants of rainforests and savannas in Australia. And I talked about how disturbance, the same disturbance, having a significant effect on habitat structure in rainforest, but not necessarily a significant effect on habitat structure in savanna, and therefore disturbance having a greater impact in forest than savanna. But it's more than that, because there are functional differences in the faunas, that the fauna of forest is much more sensitive to disturbance because it's a light intolerant, shade demanding fauna, and so it has less or lower resilience to disturbance than the light demanding fauna of savannas, which prefer open habitats. In other words, actually prefer the habitats that are created by disturbance. One hypothesis or prediction one can make based on that, that is the relationship between habitat complexity and the effects of disturbance on habitat openness and vegetation structure, interacting with differences in the functional composition of ant faunas, is that one can predict that as one increases in rainfall and goes from a highly simple vegetation structure in arid systems to a very complex habitat structure in wet systems, that there will be a gradient of increasing sensitivity to disturbance, reflecting both the increasing relative impact of that same disturbance on habitat structure, but also the decreasing resilience of the functional composition of ant faunas as one moves from arid to forest adapted ant communities. One thing that's particularly interesting, and I want to spend a little bit of time talking about this, is that you can have important differences, important different responses of ant communities to disturbance in the same habitat type, but in different parts of the world, because those different habitat types, even though they're the same, have a different biogeographical history, and that there's a very strong legacy of that history on the functional composition of that habitat. And I'm going to be talking about ant communities of savannas across the three major savanna estates of Africa, Brazil, and Northern Australia to illustrate that point. And so here's a map of savannas across the world, and some rainfall showing that they all have summer rainfall and a winter drought, which is why you don't have forest. But they also have a very similar vegetation structure of an open canopy of trees and a continuous grass layer. And in Australia, tropical savannas occur across the northern third of the continent, but there's a major rainfall gradient as one goes from the coast. Can get, in fact, up to 2 meters of rainfall inland into the central arid zone. So most of Australia is arid, and this northern third has higher rainfall, but is seasonally arid in the sense we have no rain during winter. But there's very strong rainfall gradient, and you can see the photos, obvious changes in vegetation structure as you go down that rainfall gradient. And that last one at 500 millimeters is at the northern fringe of the central arid zone. But the point of that is that the evolutionary history of our savannas isn't associated with arid ecosystems. We have nothing to the north of us, it's ocean, to receive fauna to be associated with during an evolutionary history. It's everything from the south, which is the arid zone. And so, and this is where much of Australia's savanna fauna has come from, is from the arid zone. It has an extremely arid-adapted fauna. And in fact, the fauna is functionally the same as it is throughout arid Australia. And what I want to do is go through, I've got 5 or 6 dot points here, which characterise arid ant communities in Australia, which are in fact very different from arid ant communities elsewhere in the world. And in terms of, it's in fact one of the major macroecological anomalies globally, but very poorly appreciated. And this first point of phenomenal diversity is one of these very underappreciated facts about arid Australia, this phenomenal diversity. And I'll show you some comparative figures that illustrates this. So here we are comparing arid zones of Australia, North America, and Southern Africa. And if you look at either small scale, site scale, or total, the contrast is absolutely phenomenal. And so just at a local scale, hectare scale, it's we're talking about, say, 4 times the richness. But at the regional scale, this is where it gets absolutely phenomenal, the number of species. This is very poorly known because most of these species are undescribed. Arid Australia is incredibly remote. Many places just people have never been there and collecting ants. Most of it is uncollected. And the collections that have been made have been sort of poorly analysed. And I just want to give you an illustration of that with this particular species. This is Tetramorium striolatum, which is a really nondescript little ant. And it's known to belong to a complex of species. It's the only described species in the complex, but the diversity of the complex has never been documented. And so I've spent a fair bit of time barcoding, DNA barcoding, lots of specimens of these things. And I'm going to show you some results just to give you some idea, firstly, of the phenomenal diversity, but also how unappreciated, the underappreciated diversity there. And what I'm doing here is showing you a particular part of a DNA tree, a genetic tree. And just like family trees, the shorter the branches are between species, so each of those codes on the right-hand side represent a particular specimen, and the closer or the shorter the branches are between specimens, the more closely related they are. And I've also shown you some illustrations of what these look like, and I haven't got time to go through this in detail, but I believe both based on the genetics and the morphology that there are 9 species in this little clade of Tetramorium striolatum complex. What I'm going to show you next is where this little clade fits in the bigger genetic tree of this species complex. So here it is. Look there, tiny little red box up there is where that clade fitted. And so there are literally hundreds of species of Tetramorium striolatum, only one of which is described. And in the very extensive collection we have here in Darwin, we've got more than 200 species of this complex sorted. And that's really just a tip of the iceberg, because most of Arid Australia has never been collected. And I'll give another example of a so-called widespread and variable species, Monomorium fieldi. It's formally recognised as a single species that occurs throughout inland Australia. And here's a genetic tree, a DNA tree of specimens collected from a single site, one single site near Darwin. And there are at least 10 species here. And in fact, we've recognised that. And you see these species codes, species 50, species 14, species 30, and so on. We've been publishing these codes for many, many years. But 10 species from a single site, and in fact, 6 of those species were found in a single 10-metre by 10-metre plot, which is really a phenomenal density of species within this one complex. And so, the question is, if you've got 6 species in a 10 by 10-metre plot, 10 species in a single site, how many species are there all up? Because this thing is found throughout inland Australia. And the answer is absolutely hundreds. And here is a gene tree with a much more extensive range of samples, by no means comprehensive, by no means, but I've used it to illustrate something that's really surprising. And see those red stars next to the yellow highlighted specimens that have been coded. They indicate species found in that site from the previous slide that we don't know from any other site. So they're the only records we have of that species, is just from that one site, despite really extensive surveying in the broader region. 4 of them, we only know 5. We only know from one site. So it's extremely high levels, not just of packing species in a very small area, but high levels of beta diversity, high levels of turnover among locations, or another way of looking at very high short-range endemism. Now, obviously, if we did more extensive surveys, I'm sure we'll find these at other sites, but it gives you some indication of the phenomenal diversity that we're talking about. And in fact, if the diversity of ants in arid Australia were truly appreciated, it would redefine our understanding of global ant diversity patterns. And so here's a bar chart showing what is formally understood in terms of the diversity of the genus Monomorium, which is found widespread across the world. This is the number of described species, and you can see based on that, it's found throughout the world, but overwhelmingly in the Afrotropics in Africa. It's an overwhelmingly African genus. Yes, a lot of species in Australia, but still overwhelmingly African in terms of the formal understanding of the diversity within this genus. If the true diversity in arid Australia were appreciated, it's a totally different picture. It is fundamentally a genus of arid Australia with up to maybe even 1,000 species in arid Australia. And if you look at the distribution of mega diverse genera in arid Australia, you know, one of them here has got over 1,000 species, Mellophorus. I wouldn't be surprised if it's actually more than 2,000 species, several with more than 500, and these others with more than 100. This is truly phenomenal because arid ant faunas are generally thought to be low in diversity. As an example, if an arid ant genus anywhere else in the world had more than 20 species in it, it would be considered very diverse, more than 20 species. No other arid-adapted genus anywhere in the world has over 100 species, let alone these other phenomenal figures. And in fact, I thought I'd throw this in for a Brazilian audience. This is what I think Amazonia needs to move over. Amazonia is widely considered as the global centre of ant diversity, the most diverse place for ants on Earth, but I suspect it's actually arid Australia, which is really phenomenal, given that rainforests in general have the highest ant diversity, and arid zones in general have low ant diversity. And as I mentioned, this is one of the major macro-ecological anomalies globally, I think. So that's sort of arid Australia. I'll just show some slides showing that the savanna fauna, so the northern third of the continent, has that phenomenal diversity. So we've collected extensively in the top end of the Northern Territory. This red box there, the central part projecting north in Northern Australia. It's the northern third of the Northern Territory. And we believe that there's 1,500 species just in there. And remarkably, we believe that over 80% of them are found nowhere else. And the reason for that, I'm not sure if you can see my cursor. You see this is shaded. The areas are shaded according to rainfall, the heavier shade, highest rainfall. So the top end is a high rainfall zone. And you can see there are other high rainfall zones to the west in the Kimberley and to the east in North Queensland. They're isolated from each other ecologically, climatically, and low rainfall zones between them. You see that? And so there's very, very, very high levels of endemism because the mesic adapted faunas of them, there's a barrier to the south preventing them from spreading east and west. And so each of these high rainfall zones have extremely high diversity and extremely high endemism. I should have showed that before, but North Kimberley and Cape York Peninsula similarly high endemism. And I suspect that the savanna fauna in Australia has got around 5,000 or even more species, which again is phenomenal. That's many more than is believed to be in the Amazon, many more. So quite phenomenal. And I use the term phenomenal guardedly. I mean it phenomenal. It is phenomenal. The next feature of arid faunas in Australia is exceptional abundance. And anyone who comes to Australia can't help but be struck by just how abundant ants are. Amazingly abundant. And there's very few data, though, that show this in terms of comparing abundance in Australia with elsewhere, because you have to have exactly the same sampling techniques across different parts of the world to have sort of valid data. We do actually have that in one study. Ricardo Campos, another Brazilian colleague, did this in Australia and Brazil, and you can see from his data, ant abundance in Australia was far, far higher than in Brazilian savanna across matched sites with exactly the same sampling. And ant abundance in Brazil is high. So it's phenomenal abundance. There's also unparalleled levels of behavioural dominance. And this is a feature of highly productive environments for any animal or plant taxon. This is where competition is at its greatest in areas of high productivity. And arid Australia's got exceptional productivity, and it's got exceptionally high levels of behavioural dominance. The abundance of these behaviourally dominant ants in Australia is just unprecedented anywhere, in any habitat, anywhere in the world. And I'll just illustrate that just very briefly. Looking at fine-scale foraging abundance of these behaviourally dominant ants, we've put out pitfall traps spaced at 2 metres, but many of them, so very comprehensive fine-scale coverage across a sort of a small area, and put them in for 48 hours. And these are the results in terms of captures of Iridomyrmex, the main behaviourally dominant genus in arid Australia. There are 3 functionally different types of Iridomyrmex, and each of them are illustrated across the top. The circles represent the abundance of ants in pitfall traps. Where there's no circle, that ant did not occur there. And the different shadings reflect the relative abundance. So no shading, 1 to 5 ants, black, greater than 50 ants. And you can see each of those functional groups have very comprehensive coverage. But when you put them all together, it is totally comprehensive coverage. There's no spot where there was not a behaviourally dominant ant foraging over the past 48 hours. And in many of the spots, there were over 50 of them foraging in that spot, that point, over the past 48 hours. This is not seen any other ant communities anywhere in the world. And there's evidence that such behavioural dominance has been high over evolutionary time. And here's one example of this very strong morphological and behavioural adaptation of an arid-adapted genus, Meranoplis, where there's probably 500 species in arid Australia, in which they have this very pronounced shield on the top of their body. Their heads have deep antennal grooves, and when they're disturbed, they roll on their backs, tuck their legs up under their shield, tuck their antennae into the grooves, and sit in a fetal position playing dead. And some of these, some groups of Meranoplis, the shield is just remarkable. And this is illustrated with the 2 pictures below. We call these turtle ants. We'll come back to that. You can see why they're called turtle ants. An incredibly extensive protective shield. There is no other ant in any other arid system that has anything like this morphology. But interestingly, there are 2 groups of ants in tropical rainforest, the canopies of tropical rainforest, which are other habitats of highest ant productivity, that have a comparable morphology, but independently evolved. And the first one is your own turtle ants that I'm sure many of you be familiar with, cephalotes, very widespread, common in the canopies of forests and savannas throughout the neotropics. And then a functionally equivalent genus, but evolved independently, unrelated, Catulicus, does the same thing in forests of Africa and Southeast Asia. The 4th point is highly thermophilic. So all deserts throughout the world have a small number of species that are highly specialised in terms of being able to forage when it's extremely hot. So hot that most other ants can't forage then. And if you can do that, it means you've got the foraging world all to yourself. You're not going to be hassled by other ants while you're foraging. So there's an adaptive advantage to be able to forage when it's extremely hot, too hot for other ants. Ants in arid Australia and also in Australian savannas have sort of taken this to an extreme. And there's a particular genus Mellophorus endemic to arid Australia or inland Australia. I mentioned before, I suspect it's got 2,000 species. There are many groups of them that are found primarily in savannas, and their thermophilia is quite remarkable. And so here's a slide I'm showing you on the left, which is plotting the relative foraging abundance of ants according to soil surface temperature. And in blue, towards the left-hand side, is what ants other than Mellophorus are doing. So typical ant, maximum foraging abundance is between 30 and 35 degrees soil surface temperature. And once it gets beyond 40, it gets really too hot, and foraging really is reduced and then stops. Whereas for Mellophorus, that's just when it starts. And its peak foraging is between 50 and 55 degrees Celsius. And it's still foraging at 65 degrees Celsius when protein should be denatured, and it just should not be possible to do that. So this remarkable thermophilia, which then separates these species ecologically from all other ants. And the final feature of arid Australian savanna ant faunas is a very high incidence of granivory. So seeds are a particularly important resource in desert environments throughout the world, and desert environments throughout the world have diverse guilds of specialist seed eating animals, and they can be rodents, birds, or ants. In Australia, it's particularly ants that are extremely diverse and common post-dispersal seed predators, granivores. And these seed harvesting ants are extremely abundant and diverse in Australian savannas. And I've just given you an illustration of this. This is a plot of nests of different species, half a dozen or more different harvester species within a small plot, just showing you, how diverse and how abundant these harvester ants are. So ants in Australian savannas are very much arid-adapted because the history of Australian savannas, evolutionary history, is in association with Australia's arid zone. Now, the situation is totally different in Brazil, where the evolutionary history of your savanna, Cerrados, is in association with forest. So Amazon to the north and west, and Atlantic forest to the east and south. And this is where your savanna fauna has come from. It is essentially a forest fauna. And so here are some characteristic genera of Cerrado ants. These are all forest ants. These all originated in forest and have moved into savanna more recently. An illustration of how much of a forest fauna the Brazilian savannas have is this. So one feature of forest ant faunas globally is a very high incidence of specialist arboreal species, tree nesting species. Tree nesting species are very rare outside of tropical rainforest, including savannas everywhere else in the world. And so here's some data from Ricardo Campos' study, where he did the same sampling in Brazil and Australia, just looking at the number of arboreal ant species found using the same collection. So you look in Brazil, 48 of them across many, many genera, unbelievable diversity of arboreal species. We're in Australia, 5 of them. And that's a legacy of the evolutionary association of Brazilian savanna with rainforest. And so the rainforest arboreal fauna has spilled over into savannas in a way that doesn't happen anywhere else in the world. And so if you go through that checklist of the features of the arid-adapted Australian savanna fauna and ask, well, how does the Brazilian savanna fauna stack up against that? This is what we'll do now. So phenomenal diversity. So the diversity of ants in Brazilian savanna is very high locally, often 100 species a hectare. And this reflects the fact that rainforest faunas are very, very diverse. So you'd expect the Brazilian savanna fauna to be diverse, and it is locally, but it's not at the broader scale. I've been told that the latest estimate of the total savanna, Brazilian savanna, the total Cerrado fauna is only 700 species. So you can get 100 species in a hectare, but there's only 700 all up across this vast biome. And the reason for that, there was two reasons for that. One is that the biome doesn't have that same rainfall gradient that we have in Australia. And so all the Brazilian savannas are quite mesic, between 800 metres and about millimetres of rain and about 1,500 millimetres of rain. And in the lower rainfall areas, in the Caatinga, in the northeast, the Caatinga ant fauna is just a depauperate subset of the Cerrado fauna. It does not have a specialist arid-adapted fauna. And so that's one reason why the Cerrado ant fauna across its whole extent is relatively low in diversity, because you don't have that great diversity in rainfall. But also, many of the Cerrado species, ant species, are very broadly adapted. They're found in forests. They're found in all sorts of habitats, even found in Caatinga. They're extremely widespread. So you don't have that spatial turnover that you do in the Australian savannas. And so the entire fauna is far less diverse than it is in Australia. Exceptional abundance, it's moderately abundant. Now, ants are moderately abundant in, by any other standards, they're highly abundant, but nothing compared to Australia. Unparalleled levels of behavioural dominance. I don't have time to go into detail, but you do have behaviourally dominant ant genera there, particularly dolichoderines, but they're extremely patchy, very localised, and much of the Cerrado just does not have these behaviourally dominant ants. Extremely low levels of thermophilia. There are no specialist thermophilic ants in the Brazilian Cerrado. A totally different situation to that in Australia. And similarly, specialist seed harvester ants are almost totally absent. There's just one that occurs in Brazilian Cerrado, this species of Iridomyrmex. Iridomyrmex is a major harvester genus of the deserts of Mexico and southern United States, and this one gets into Cerrado. So very, very different functional fauna in the ant fauna of Brazilian savannas, very, very different functionally to that in Australian savannas. And because of that, you might expect differences in the resilience to disturbance, that the arid-adapted nature of Australian savannas, savanna ants, you would think would confer a high degree of resilience to fauna, because they prefer open habitats. They prefer the sorts of habitats that disturbance produces. Whereas the forest-derived fauna of Brazilian savannas, you'd expect to have a much lower resilience, because forest taxa do not like open habitats in general. So is there evidence of this in terms of responses to the major agent of disturbance in savannas globally, and that is fire? And yes, the answer is yes. So here in Australia, I've got an ordination of experimental plots burnt in different ways from a fire experiment we've been running near Darwin. The experiment has 6 different fire treatments. If you just analyse the data, change the effects of these treatments on species composition, there's no significant effect of any of the differences, ranging from burning every year to not burning at all. No difference between any particular treatment after 8 years. You do get a statistically significant difference if you group the fire treatments into the extremes. In the green, it's burning every 1 or 2 years, and in the blue, it's burning either every 5 years or not burning at all. And you can see that there is a cluster there. There's still overlap, but there is a distinct cluster, but overlap, indicating a very high resilience of that ant fauna to fire. In contrast, results from experimental burning trials in Brazilian savanna, both for trees and ground, every different fire treatment studied, burning every 2 years, every 4 years, or unburnt, has a very distinct fauna. Species composition is very distinct, with no overlap between each of the 3 treatments, indicating a low degree of resilience to fire in Brazil, as we predicted. What about African savannas? Just very briefly, the African savanna ant fauna has neither a strong tropical forest element or a strong arid-adapted element. It is dominated by taxa that are highly generalized. And here's the scorecard. It has none of the features, none of them, of Australian savannas. Whether it's diversity, abundance, behavioural dominance, granivory, none of those features are shared in the African savanna fauna. So all these highly generalised species. But then you might think in terms of response to disturbance, because they're highly generalised, you might think they've got a reasonably high resilience to disturbance. And that is the case. So here's some results from a long-term fire experiment going over 50 years, where the black dots are plots that have been unburnt for more than 50 years, and the open dots, open circles, are all the other treatments. And there's 5 or 6 other treatments that vary the frequency of burning and the time of year of burning, but they have no impact. The frequency, time of year has no impact. The only difference is if you have total fire exclusion over 50 years. So again, that's showing a very high resilience of the ant fauna to fire. So I spent a fair bit of time talking about that, but I think it's a really interesting point of how you can have the same vegetation type, the same biome in different parts of the world, having totally different faunas that reflects their contrasting biogeographical histories, totally different faunas in terms of functional composition, but also their dynamics in relation to disturbance. So I'll just sort of finish by summarising what I think is the case, and that is disturbance is all about effects on habitat structure, habitat openness. Habitat openness is the key. Same species can show different responses to the same disturbance in different habitats because of the different effects of that same disturbance on habitat openness. That ant community responses will vary according to the functional composition in relation to habitat openness. And that functional composition and therefore community responses to disturbance will vary predictably not only amongst habitats, but also biogeographic regions where you have the same habitat types but different evolutionary histories. And I don't have time to talk about this, but I think that these principles have very wide applicability to plants and other faunal groups. And I recently published a review of this in which I talk about that in more detail. So if you're interested in following it up, just recently published in Diversity in Distributions. So thank you very much. That's where I'll finish. And I'm very pleased to take questions. I'll hand back over to Luciana, who sort of will moderate these questions.
Thank you very much, Alan. Thank you for this outstanding talk and very interesting. And so we have already some questions here in the chat. We have many boa noites, good evening, and good mornings for you. We have greetings from Mexico. And so I will start with a question from Fernanda. You can see?
Yes, I can see that. So grasslands and forests occur in dynamic mosaics, yes, and then disturbance regimes that include fire. Absolutely, that's the occurs in all the tropics of high but highly seasonal rainfall. Very true.
And the second part?
And so I think a key to this is that the tropical forests, the neotropical forests, are a lot older than the savannas. So I can't remember how far back they go, but several tens of millions of years. So they're very old, and so they predated the open habitats or the drier habitats of the neotropics. And so when the savannas were evolving, the rainforest fauna was already established, and so it received the rainforest fauna. So they weren't evolving at the same time, if you know what I mean. And so, but having said that, because the many of the Cerrado species are also found in forest, then yes, there's obviously quite a few generalist, large number of quite generalized species by definition if they're found both in savanna and forest, and many of them are found throughout very, very large area of entire Brazil, which is sort of unusual anywhere else in the world to have such a that large continental scale sort of distribution of so many species.
Okay. So we have a question from Frederico Neves.
Fred, how are you? Good to hear from you and see you. Yes, that's the first part. I agree. What's the second part? For changing composition over time. So, Fred, I'm not sure if you mean over time as in during the day. Do you mean time as in seasonal time over during the year, or do you mean sort of like evolutionary time over hundreds of thousands of millions of years? And so I'm not sure. I would say in terms of evolutionary time, you would expect that the savanna fauna would change a lot more over evolutionary time as it sort of develops arid-adapted features than the forest fauna, because the forest fauna has already been evolving for a long, long, long time, whereas the Cerrado fauna, and I think it's only about 5 million years old or something like that, so relatively young. It's the same for trees. And I should have perhaps mentioned that, is that the Cerrado is unusual from a tree perspective too, in that anywhere else in the world, most tropical genera are either savannas genera or forest genera. Very few are diverse in both habitats, whereas in the Cerrado, the plant genera tend to be forest genera, the same, and which is unusual. But again, it reflects a relatively recent evolution of the Cerrado from essentially forests for both the plants or trees and the ants. So I'm sorry if I'm misunderstanding the time scale you're talking about. I can't think of change in how it's relevant to change in time at a daily scale or a seasonal scale, but certainly an evolutionary scale, yes.
Mm-hmm. Okay. We have thank you.
Thanks, Kalani.
As you said about the other groups.
Yes, and so let's maybe start. So one of the features of ants, like other insects, is that they are endothermic, ectothermic. That is, they rely on environmental heat, and so ectotherms, you would then predict, would be especially sensitive to habitat openness or responsive to changes in habitat openness, because that then determines how much environmental heat they have, essentially. And ants, more generally, outside of rainforests, they're more generally thermophilic creatures that, you just don't find them much in very cold places. And so the vertebrate taxon you would look at as paralleling responses to disturbance in relation to habitat openness are reptiles. And there are a lot of studies, in fact, that sort of show the importance of habitat openness for reptiles and how disturbance is related to effects on habitat openness. But there are also other studies for other vertebrates as well. So I suggest, so Fernando, if you can get a copy of that review that was recently published, there is a trail of references in there that if you wanted to follow that up more broadly. If you can't get a copy, just drop me an email and I'll send you a copy. But in that paper, I do talk a fair bit and give examples from other taxa. I think you'd find plant ecologists out there that it's very similar for plants. There are many groups of plants that respond very strongly to habitat openness or not.
So Federico says,
yes, thanks, Fred. Hope
Good.
you're about to catch up. Who knows when.
Good to see you too. So I have a question, Alan. So here in South Brazil, we have natural grasslands, right? And so fire disturbance is very common here, especially in the highlands, the highlands, in Atlantic forest biome in the north of Rio Grande do Sul. So we already know, based in several studies, that the main way of regeneration of the plant communities is the resprouting from the organs from below ground, right? So we can say that better than resilient, these plants can be resistant to fire, right? Because they just after fire they lose the above ground biomass, but they resprout and rapidly grow again.
No, that's although Luciana, I'm wondering whether that's still resilience, because it's resistance means it's not affected in the first place. So resistance would mean that it would not lose biomass, and so just not be burnt, if you know what I mean. But I know exactly what you mean. It's incredible. Well, actually, I don't know exactly what you mean in your grasslands, as we know. I'm not familiar with your study system, and very eager to be, but familiar with the Cerrado. With this has unbelievable. The grassland is unbelievably diverse and unbelievable powers of resprouting, and I'm sort of familiar with a paper from Alessandra Fidelis. Reporting flowering within 24 hours of a fire, which is just unheard of.
So my question, and so we have some researchers with ants and communities here, and we didn't publish it yet, but we found that the ant composition doesn't change with fire. So the ant composition is the same, and we didn't detect any response in ant species individually too. So my question is, if we can compare grassland plant communities with these ant grassland communities, so would ants be like this fire resistant or fire resilient plant because of their underground nests? Can we compare with plants and ants?
Yeah, in one sense, no, because the plants are actually, the biomass of plants is consumed, and so there's a direct effective disturbance, but they're highly resilient in terms of they just regenerate very quickly. Whereas for the ants, the biomass will not be consumed, and they're resilient, but it's not because they're resprouting or recovering. It's because they, are buffered in their soil nests. But in both cases, the effect of fire is very limited. One of the really interesting things about your grasslands, and that's why I'm just not familiar with them, because they're really temperate, because it's higher elevation. Temperature, cold temperatures comes into it, so they're temperate grasslands, and so they're actually very different. They're not just Cerrado with no trees. It's a very different system, and I'm not familiar with it. Not familiar with the ant fauna, but it'll be very different having a temperature limitation, cold temperature limitation. And so one obvious thing is ant diversity there is much lower at a site scale than in Cerrado, much lower. I mean, you're never going to get 100 species per hectare. No. And so it means, the evolutionary forces on them are very different from those in Cerrado. And I'm not, so I need to get more familiar with that fauna to work out how it responses to disturbance. But you're right. I mean, grassland ant faunas more generally are highly resilient in relation to fire. Highly resilient. And so it'd be interesting to look at the functional, or even the species or the genus composition of your fauna, the extent to which it's got a lot of really forest-associated things, or it's really just a highly generalised fauna. And I suspect that's the case. It's much more highly generalised than you would get in Cerrado, and therefore much more resilient in relation to fire. A bit more like the Savanna fauna in Africa in that sense. That would be a thought.
Okay, thanks, Alan. We have a question from Juliana Cordeiro.
Yeah, no, that's a good point. So if disturbance, instead of opening up the habitat, made it more shady through increase in invasive species, exactly right. You would predict that disturbance, that the arid-adapted biota that would normally be promoted by disturbance would be reduced by disturbance if disturbance ultimately results in invasion by woody species. And there are quite a few examples around the world where that is the case. So no, that's a very good point. Thanks, Juliana.
And we have a question from Valério Pilar.
Well, yeah. So I think this covers what I was, what I've just been talking about now with Luciana, is that the functional composition of your temperate grasslands and communities is very different from savanna, and it's something I'm not familiar with, and so I really don't know, but I've been very interested just to get out there and work with Luciana and her team and just see what is happening there, because it's not just the grasslands are very different, the forests are very different. Whenever you have cool temperature as a key limiting factor, it has huge functional consequences. So the forest, not that I'm familiar with what the Atlantic forests, I know you've got Araucaria there, which indicates things are very different. The functional composition of the Atlantic forest at altitude there down south, I don't know how different it is to Atlantic forest up the east coast, but presumably it's very different functionally. And so they're both those issues that one needs to think about, and I'm just not familiar enough with them. But it's a really interesting point to be investigating further, which I hope we'll be able to do.
And Juliana said, thank you.
Juliana?
And we have more questions, please. This is your chance to do it. We have the attention of Ellen here. Oh, Pedro, here.
Thanks, Pedro. Absolutely. Hopefully. Absolutely. I just look forward to being able to get there, and hopefully it won't be too much longer. Won't be this year, unfortunately, but hopefully things will change next year.
Yeah. And thanks from Gerhard.
Thanks, Gerhard. Thank you.
Yeah, we need your visit here after the pandemic.
Yes, and so I normally don't need a particular excuse to get across to Brazil. I've been traveling over there regularly over the last several years, but I've never been way down south, and it's always been, well, a lot of it in Caatinga actually, but also in the Cerrado. Never down south, so very keen to get way down there. Thanks, Edgar.
Gabrielle.
Miss Gabrielle. Jose, well, lovely to hear from you. How's your retirement treating you? Yes, unfortunately, I can't see you, but thanks for getting in touch. Oh, not sure who that's from, but thank you.
This is it's our program.
Yeah, but I'm not sure who's behind it, but thank you.
Is Jefferson Bugoni. He's behind.
Jefferson, thank you. Thank you, Danielle.
And Cassia.
Thank you, Cassia. Nice to see you. I can see a little picture of you. See?
This is it.
Great.
Wow.
Oh. Thank you.
Yeah, so our next seminar will be given by Dr. Helge Bru. I can't. Sorry. In May, and so we didn't define the date yet. So we will keep you posted on social media and the other sources. And please follow us in the Instagram and Facebook. And Alan, thank you very much for your talk and your participation and the questions. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Luciana. Now, just before you go, I'm just wondering, maybe we should organise some sort of regular Zooms or some video conferencing with Pedro and Cassia and us, just to talk about Cassia's PhD. Would that be a...
Yeah, sure. It would be great. Yeah. We can prepare a meeting and discuss.
I think that would be nice to do, and I'm happy to do it either this time slot or the reverse. You know, whatever's easier. There's Marianne. Do you remember Marianne? Luciana? I think you met at where's Bahia when we had the meeting in Bahia.
Hello. How are you?
I'm good. I'm just bringing him a cup of tea in his new ant.
Hang on, I'll show you this. My new ant cup.
Don't tip it on you.
I won't. You're right.
So we just bought some new cups with ants on them.
Wow, nice.
But we've just finished.
Yes.
So.
Okay. I will finish here the broadcast.
Thanks very much, Luciana. All the best.